So the title of my talk today, Building Bridges Not Walls, An Approach to Web Accessibility. Today I will be talking to you all about how I constructed my company's initial accessibility plan, pitfalls and successes, and how you can start your own accessibility plan. Now, it's quite impossible for me to teach you how to make your entire application accessible in 25 minutes. So instead, I want to show you how to plan for accessibility so you can be successful for upcoming implementation. So first off, again, my name is Ashley Jean, and here is my Twitter, so let's be friends. A little bit about myself. I work as a software engineer at a company called mdlogix, based in Baltimore. We build applications surrounding behavioral health integration and chronic care management. I'm a part-time graduate student at Towson University studying computer science. I am a co-organizer for the Baltimore Hackathon, and I sit on the industry advisory board for an organization called Code in the Schools. And for those asking that question, I do sleep. So my talk today will be divided into 4 objectives. First, we will dive into the reasons for implementing accessibility. Secondly, how you can create an accessibility road plan. And then we will dive into the key lessons I learned while constructing my plan. And lastly, how to start your own plan starting Monday. So reasons why you should talk about accessibility. Based on evolving industry standards, accessibility can no longer be optional. It needs to be a requirement. Accessibility at my company began to be a topic of discussions during meetings. Since the majority of our applications are handled by a diverse group of users, we realized that it was in our best interest to begin to facilitate a conversation around accessibility. Having applications that were accessible to all of our users could affect our current base, establish future contracts, and overall make our application more robust. We knew accessibility wasn't a fast trend and it was here to stay. Reason 2, universal design principles. So universal design is defined as the process of creating products that are accessible to people with a wide range of abilities, disabilities, and other characteristics. The most common product of universal design is a ramp. Their initial intent was to serve wheelchairs. However, they are often used by parents with baby strollers, delivery staff with rolling carts, and skateboarders, for better or for worse. When it comes to applications, creating for accessibility not only helps those with permanent impairment, but also those that are impaired situationally and temporarily. Video captions help those to watch a video in a noisy environment. And good color contrast helps those when there's a glare. Reason 3, the future of the web depends on it. To put it into numbers, there are 1 billion people living with disabilities. That is about 15 to 20% of the world's population. And all of the information is linked on the source below. Number-wise, according to the American Institute of Research, working age people with disabilities in the US alone have a discretionary income of $21 billion. In fact, the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities defines the access to information, including the web, as a human right. Many companies have and currently are being sued for not having accessible websites. So Target, FedEx, even Beyonce. So it's possible to be sued if your application isn't accessible to users. The last reason is it allows for the development of new skills. Adapting accessible principles into your apps allow developers to have an exposure to new tools and concepts. If your team doesn't have the means to hire an accessibility expert, learning accessibility as a team would be a great way to collaborate with different members on your team while learning something new. This means that constructing a plan might take longer due to the learning gap, but this shouldn't discourage you. Which leads me to tell you a quick story, how I was tasked with creating our initial plan. So last year, my boss mentioned the need for our company and application to have a universal accessibility plan. I knew minimal amount about accessibility and thought diving into the project would be a great way to learn more. So I thought, sure, I'd be interested in learning web accessibility. I'd love to take the challenge of developing a company-wide plan for tackling accessibility with no experience. Sure, no problem. So here I am, ready to take on accessibility. I had my pen, paper, trusty Google. I was ready, my computer was ready. We were ready to do this. For some reason, I feel like my computer's personality is Stanley from The Office. I don't know why, but now what do? What do I type? Everything, I guess. Accessibility for newbies, how to make your apps accessible, testing tools for accessibility, the list goes on. Now my computer is all shades of confused. But I'm thinking there's a reason to my madness. I'll just stumble upon what I need, a resource that encompasses everything. I just need to keep reading and hammering away, so I continue. Now my computer just wants to leave. 50 tabs later, 2% battery, it had enough. Then I type one more thing, and then my computer blows up. Just kidding, obviously that didn't happen. But I tell you this story to say that planning for accessibility requires you to have a roadmap, a plan that enables your research to have some sort of direction. Because we all know accomplishing a goal needs a plan. I believe in order to create a company-wide accessibility plan, you need to break it up into 6 concrete steps. These steps serve as your roadmap and will lead you to the right direction. The first one is defining a scope. You're able to customize your research and plan based on your application. For example, at my company, we have multiple actions that users can do around the collection of data and completing assessments. So one area to observe would be the process of completing a form. You can take a more linear approach and define the entire application as your product scope. A huge undertaking, but that's an approach nonetheless. In Laura Kahlberg's book, Accessibility for Everyone, she also recommends that we ask these next few questions when scoping the product. Like, who are the target audience for your product? What are their needs, restrictions, and technology preferences? How can accessibility be integrated during production? And which target platforms, browsers, operating systems, and assistive technologies should you test your product on? Once your product scope is defined, you could then move to the research phase a bit more smoothly. If you're entirely new to accessibility, you can start by learning the 4 accessibility principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Then you can move on to learning about accessibility components, best practices, the latest popular tools to help you creating accessible apps. Tools such as Google Lighthouse is a great tool to start with. Among many things, you can use Lighthouse to run audits on your site and check your current accessibility score. Next, how will you test? Will you recruit folks with disabilities to test your application? Will you contact organizations such as the Federation of the Blind for Perspective? By the way, their national headquarters is in Baltimore, Maryland. Or will you slowly do automated and manual testing? Your company testing strategy is the most important step of this entire process. Likewise, what tools will you use to test? Again, Lighthouse or Wave, another evaluation tool. Or Totally, a JS library that helps visualize how your site performs with assistive technologies. Which screen reader will you use? NVDA, or what color blindness tool would be the best? Next, implementation. What would you recommend the team start with? Small ones are popular choice. It's a great way to get your feet wet and build confidence. you're able to use what you've learned quickly and start to gain some momentum. Lastly, you want to circle back and make sure that your findings and strategies align with the goals, priorities, and motivations that the team set for itself. The order may differ depending on experience and accomplished steps beforehand, but the main point is that you want to illustrate how having a goal with a plan and a purpose will give your work direction. And what you'll realize is that the roadmap will ultimately lead to the creation of the plan, and you'll be closer to accomplishing accessibility goals. Don't you wish your computer just smiled at you after you sent some bomb code? So now let's dive into lessons I learned throughout the process. The first lesson I learned was to highlight examples of use case scenarios and features. That was one thing I wish I did at the beginning of my plan. It also aligns with defining the scope. For my company's case, an example of a use case would be a patient filling out a form. Through feature specs, aka a high-level test, we can comb through the steps and take a look at the steps a user takes in order to complete a form. Writing down or making a mental note of that step is a great way to start. So when you're doing research and you stumble upon ARIA, and for those who don't know, ARIA is a set of attributes that define ways to make a web content and web apps more accessible. It clicks that ARIA labels will allow screen readers to interpret the element better for folks using a keyboard. Also, within this particular example, simply using the attributes role and ARIA check will cause the node to have the desired role and state without changing anything else about the node's appearance and behavior. The voiceover will be able to interpret the element more precisely with this extra information, something that would be perfect for your forms. The second lesson I adapted fairly quickly, and that was to stick to one objective at a time. Learning about accessibility and trying to implement accessibility in your apps can be quite chaotic. And if you're anyone like me who had limited experience, it's quite overwhelming too. That's why I highly recommend that you break your objectives down. If you're an accessibility newbie, start with the basics. As mentioned previously, you want to take each step separately. It allows you to give each step the attention that it needs. Breaking down the phase to research, implementation strategies, testing, etc., allows for a better, well-rounded plan. Lesson 3, the plan is subject to change. So similarly to the agile life cycle, when constructing the plan, things are subject to change. You might find that a particular testing tool doesn't coexist well with your environment, or it's deprecated, or the way that you thought a particular user would use a feature is completely different from how it's actually being used. Lastly, you might have neglected a target group altogether and need to go back and do research on how to meet their requirements. Your plan won't be your last. Edits and tweaks will need to be made to expand on your plan. The last lesson I used was strategically utilizing external references. Thankfully, accessibility is a huge topic in our industry right now, so the information on accessibility is endless. When constructing the initial plan, I contacted a friend who was just wrapping up with her company's plan. She generously provided me links, videos, and other information that enabled me to have a basis on what to search and what aspects of accessibility was important. Also, I found that universities tend to have a copy of their accessibility plan posted on their website. It was extremely helpful when I came down to sit and write my company's plan. This will also give you an idea of the different formats you can use. For those who want another option, there's Twitter. So I'm sure folks here use it for professional networking, tech advice, and for me, the memes. But I also found a ton of useful gems just by searching that hashtag Alley. Alley is somewhat of an acronym that you can use as a hashtag to search and find people and all things related to accessibility. Through this, I found books, up-to-date material, and much more. So constructing a plan for accessibility is a daunting task, believe me, but it doesn't have to be done alone. So get connected to the Alley community. So over here you see, so Alley project has a great checklist for creating initial accessibility checks such as categories such as JavaScript and forms. So now that I've thrown all this information at you, I'd love to know the background of this, by the way. I wanted to show you a few ways that you can use what we've discussed today and start implementing it on Monday. First, to recap, you want to talk about it. So don't let the conversation stop here. Continuing at work. Maybe talk about this conference talk or show talks, checklists, etc. The more you talk about it, the more that it's heard. Secondly, you want to prioritize. So again, defining the scope, use cases, maybe audit a site using Lighthouse. So if you go into your dev tools, it's the last tab and it's called audits, where you could audit your site. And then lastly, initial plan phase. So if you can't hire an expert, how can you divide the work? Who can be involved? How long will it take to create an initial plan? Can you set up a build in the meantime? If not, can you write an RFC, aka request for change, and send it out to your team for initial findings? Brainstorm the roadmap. Familiarize yourself with accessibility core concepts if you're new. And lastly, start the cycle. Lastly, here is the initial accessibility plan I drafted for my company. In the first plan, I provided an overview and definitions on accessibility, testing approaches that we could use for our diverse group of users. And the last page was initial checks you could do. So this is taken straight out of Alley's checklist. Here are some resources that I used to create this talk and the plan. Don't worry, I'll post this all on Twitter along with the slides. It's a lot. It's books. So remember, it doesn't have to be done alone. Let's continue to build applications with accessibility at the forefront of our mind. Thanks, everyone.